Good afternoon and welcome to our Saturday afternoon plenary session. My name is Mike O'Driscoll. I'm Associate Dean Research in the Faculty of Arts and a member of the Board of Directors with the Parkland Institute. And I'll be your host and moderator for the next 75 minutes. I am absolutely thrilled to be introducing our next speaker and to welcome Duncan Cameron back to the University of Alberta. He's one of our own and we're deeply proud to say so. Duncan is president of and columnist at rabble.ca, where in that capacity he leads one of Canada's most successful online journalism ventures, producing news for the rest of us in a demonstration of what ethical, activist, and open access journalism really looks like. He's also the author and editor of 11 books that range in topic from economic ethics to constitutional politics, and especially influential work in the area of trade policy. But I wanted to know a little more, and so having spent some time online sorting out Duncan's biography, and having determined that he is neither Duncan Cameron the fur trader, nor a hero of the Crimean War, nor the prolific Canadian photojournalist, nor indeed the legendary shinty player, however cool that sounds, I can tell you a few other things. Following graduation from the University of Alberta, he joined the Federal Department of Finance in 1966 and was financial advisor to the Canadian delegation at the UN in 1967. As I said to him earlier, a real prodigy. After working for CETA, he went on to complete a doctorate from the University of Paris I in 1976. A member of the political science department at the University of Ottawa until 2004, Duncan is now an adjunct professor of political science at Simon Fraser University, a director of the Carl Polanyi Institute of Political Economy at Concordia University in Montreal, and a research fellow of the Centre for Global Political Economy at SFU. If you want to see what Duncan's up to on a week-to-week basis, check out his regular column on Rabble, as I like to do. Tuesday's piece, for example, is a wonderfully smart critique of the conservative economic policies of our new Liberal government, and in its critique of austerity is nicely aligned with Alex Himmelfarb's wonderful talk last night. It's great to see our best minds thinking in unison. It's also a great honor to have Duncan join us today. His talk is titled Agenda for a Peaceful Revolution. Please join me in welcoming Duncan Cameron.
Well, thank you very much, Michael, and of course it's a great pleasure for me to be here today as well at the University of Alberta. It's a pleasure to be in Alberta under an NDP government. I believe the first victory for the NDP was a by-election in Pincher Creek and the Crow's Nest Pass. And it'll be 50 years this coming fall, I believe. And the students from the New Democratic Youth went up every weekend to sign up people. And the people they told me won the election for them were the communists from the Crow's Nest Pass, the miners. And so it's fitting justice that 50 years later, the NDP would form the government here. And of course, we have a lot of hopes for them, and we'll also have our eyes on them. Well, I start with a simple premise that we need to change the way we live together on this planet. As the saying goes, there is no planet B. Another world here on Earth is not only possible, it's necessary. So I call this, or we could call this, a peaceful revolution. It will involve acting politically. It's about political change. And our conference is about Alberta and the future of Canada. It's about political change in Alberta and Canada. I'm going to speak about some of the lessons that I learned from the time I grew up in Edmonton and on campus here until today. When I've done that, I'm going to talk about us, some of the issues that I think we are facing. And then I want to talk about now, some of the things I think need to happen right now. It's not every university that has an openly left-wing think tank. So I want to salute the Parkland Institute. I was lucky enough to be here for the consultations when Parkland was being set up. And if we have an NDP government in Alberta today, it's maybe in part because 20 years ago, Gord Laxer and others, Trevor Harrison, had the foresight to think of this possibility of a political economy research unit which would be unabashedly about Canadian political economy. And the dean at the time, Patricia Clement, was very farsighted in putting money into such a project, and frankly, I'm so pleased to be a University of Alberta graduate because of it. Well, when you act politically, you come up against what I call the 5 laws of politics, one for each finger of your hand. And these are laws because they're unavoidable. There's something anybody who's undertakes anything politically has to deal with and face. The first one is the easiest one, and it's the one that in some quarters that's all people ever get to, and that's leadership. You know, I was born in 1944, and my father was in the service. I was a war baby. The great names of the war, Winston Churchill, we have Churchill Square here in Edmonton, FDR, and Stalin, Hitler. These figures, these leaders, for good or bad, for evil or good, these were the major sort of parts of our political lives. And so when we looked at leadership, we said to ourselves, well, this is what politics is about. Politics is about leadership. And it is about leadership. But it's not just about leadership. When I see Rachel Notley become Premier of Alberta, I see in her the empathy and the compassion of a great social democratic leader. I see the same traces in Jack Layton. When you think of what leadership leads to, I think a leader is someone who's successful in building support. They make progress, they make things happen, and so long as they make things happen, we're happy to support them. But when they start to make things happen, they're going to also build opposition. And when opposition comes, then we have conflict. And we'll support our leader until we start to think that they no longer have the key to progress and to making things better. And at that point, the issue arises of democratic accountability. In the case of Stephen Harper as a leader, he was able to govern without really having democratic accountability to anyone other than his caucus, who had given him carte blanche. Well, we gave Stephen Harper the door, but it was after 10 years of a fair amount of damage to Canada. So I think if I have a theme for how we're going to change things, my theme would be democratic accountability. We want to ensure that our leaders at every level are democratically accountable. Now, the interesting thing about leadership is that you don't have to be elected to be a leader. Bridget DePape stands up in the Senate of Canada when it's on television because it's the speech from the throne. Stop Harper. A day later, Stephen Harper's at the Boston Garden to watch a hockey game. Somebody's sitting behind him. Stop Harper. Stop signs all over Vancouver. Stop Harper. Bridget joined with the Council of Canadians and the Get Out the Vote campaign. And, in the last election, the Conservatives got the same amount of votes that they got in 2011. But the difference was that the percentage of the vote went up by 8 or 9 points. And, of course, a lot of those people were young people. And it looks like most of them voted Liberal. So you can be a leader without even having an elected position or without having... I think of Mel Hurtig, my friend, who was a book publisher in Edmonton, and he would just start things, make things happen. From a position, nobody had elected him to anything, but there he was leading and he was talking and people were helping him out. Our notion of leadership it goes back to Greco-Roman times and to our Judeo-Christian sort of heritage. We got our idea about leaders from Moses and from the great leaders of ancient Greece. In ancient Greece, we put an end to Oriental despotism. The French Revolution finished off the absolute monarch. Now we have to live with this idea of democratic leadership, and we still got a fair amount of ground to cover. Well, it was at this university, in a lecture given by a series of lectures in Politics 360 given by Neville Linton in 1964, that I learned the second law of politics, power. Politics is about power, it's about conflict. And all of a sudden we had a narrative, and we had a tool for analysis. And we could start looking at whatever came up and say, whose interests does play, what is the balance of political forces, how is power going to play itself out? Now, power can be materially based. I think principally it is economic, because you need a strong economy in order to have a military. But there's a whole world of power politics, of international politics. You think of the peace dividend period, where George Bush and Gorbachev agreed that NATO would not expand. And the next thing you know, NATO's expanding under Clinton. And why is it expanding? Well, the peace dividend meant that there weren't as many arms sales. And if a group of Eastern European countries could be brought in to NATO and buy NATO-compatible equipment, the American military-industrial complex could sell more armaments. So now we have a new sort of revived Cold War with NATO on the borders of Russia. Power in the Canadian context is most difficult to deal with when it's concentrated economic power, because concentrated economic power can dominate the political process. And it does dominate the political process. And so if you're trying to make changes, you want to transform your country, how do you deal with concentrated economic power? Rachel Notley has on her plate the fall in the price of oil and the stranded investments that have been made by the major oil companies in the bitumen sands of Alberta. And she's going to have to deal with that. And we're all going to be under pressure from the oil companies to do things differently. And we'll see to what extent we can mobilize, and people will mobilize, to ensure that the public interest in Alberta is the one that becomes dominant. So power is both the sort of the currency of politics. It's how we calculate things in politics, and it's also the sort of the test of any political project. Do you handle power well? Are you able to use what power you have to advance your ideas? I had to go to France to learn about the third law of politics, the law of ideology. I suppose I thought, after being at the University of Alberta and learning about power, and have been in Ottawa and analyzing things in terms of power, that we were all within a context where there was a dominant set of ideas, and I'd absorbed them, and I more or less agreed with them. But when I got to France, I realized there were a lot of competing sets of ideas, and they were much more, they were wider and fuller than the simple idea of communism versus capitalism or fascism versus democracy. There was a range of ideas that were embedded in political action, and those ideologies were very important. And in fact, they helped explain some of the emotional and irrational aspects of politics. Perhaps the most potent of ideologies is nationalism. Nationalism, you think of the socialist internationals at the end of the 19th century, and they're working to avoid war. And when war comes, everybody signs up and they go off and in a bloodbath kill each other for 5 years. Now, the French socialist leader Jean Jaurès was against war, and he was assassinated a week before the outbreak. Well, these ideologies are very, very significant. Now, nationalism likes to believe it's an englobing ideology and that we're all part of it. But in reality, ideologies are closely associated with social classes. And there's an ideology of a dominant class. And there is a dominant class in the world today, the corporate class that meets at Davos. And the ideology of this group is neoliberalism. And if you're a neoliberal, for you, a wage is a cost. A wage and a salary are cost. If you're a worker, of course, these are a benefit. So lower wages lead to lower costs. So you want free markets to operate for labor. You're quite prepared to see unemployment insurance cut, so you cut it. You're quite prepared to see wages go down. You're quite prepared to see, therefore, unions weakened. And when you're finished with weakening UI and weakening unions, and people have nothing left but welfare, then you cut access to welfare. So people have to work for nothing. And that neoliberal ideology is the one that has taken root across the world. And it's a class issue. How do we organize the majority of people who work for a wage, work for a salary? I don't know that we can call them the working class, but they're certainly working. They're the people that don't have an independent wealth base for income. Thomas Piketty, the French analyst of inequality, talks about the rich, the top 10% of income earners, and he talks about the poor, the bottom 50%. If you put a line in the middle of each society, you get the median. The people who are below the median are basically poor. And those people are the people to whom he thinks public policy should be directed, and tax policy. The remaining 40% are the middle class. And those 40% are the ones that Justin Trudeau's promised a tax cut to, and that they will probably get. So the issue of social class is very much tied up with the way you see the world. If you see the world as an investor, you don't see the world in the same way if you see it as a single mother on welfare. And when you're looking to make political change, you have to assess your ideologies, your social democratic ideology or your green ideology or whatever set of ideas you think can lead to change. You have to look at them very, very closely. Mobilization. The fourth law of politics is mobilization. I learned about mobilization from the Canadian feminist movement. We were studying, I had been hired, I was a political economist, I'd been hired to teach Canadian politics at the University of Ottawa. I'd spent 5 or 6 years trying to get a little deeper into this subject matter I hadn't really studied. And Pierre Trudeau repatriates the Constitution. Now in the United States, women have been fighting for decades to get the ERA, an Equal Rights Amendment, into the American Constitution, and failing. Well, Doris Anderson of Calgary, eminent journalist, editor, and feminist, decided that it just wasn't going to do to ignore women's equality rights and equality rights in general. And so she thought that women across Canada should organize to ensure that the Canadian Constitution reflected the fact that half of the population were women. And she won. She won because she mobilized women. She won because she had a terrific argument. So mobilization is the key strategy for political change. If you want to make something happen, you have to mobilize people. So you say to me, so that was 30 years ago, that was 40 years ago. So what happened? People mobilized. People mobilized again in 1988 against the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement. And we've had a lot of wins on issues that are important issues, like same-sex marriage and gay rights. But generally speaking, what neoliberalism has done very cleverly is it's demobilized people. It's demobilized people. So here I am growing up in Edmonton. 80% of the population were voting in elections. People pretty well knew that the people who weren't voting were the poor. So if you decided to present a policy that was tax cuts for the rich, your chances of getting elected on that program were pretty thin, because only maybe 20% of the population were going to be interested in that, the top 20, and the wannabes. And there were 60% who were still voting, who were probably going to prefer Medicare, a generous welfare program, an art bank, federal assistance for tuition fees, and the kinds of investments that were made in Canada, particularly in 1965, in the 65 period, just before I arrived in Ottawa. That was the Pearson minority government from 63 to 68, supported by the NDP. When most of Canada's national institutions were put together, the ones that were then dismantled in the 90s, some of them by the son, Paul Martin, of the man who'd put the other ones in place 30 years earlier, I often wondered what he had against his father. So demobilization allows what? Well, it allows what Trevor Harrison and Gord Laxer identified as Ralph Klein, in Ralph Klein, and subsequently in Mike Harris, the Trojan horse. It arouses, if you've only got 60% of the people voting, if people think that politics is corrupt, politicians are corrupt, there's no point in voting, there's no reason to, they'll never change anyway, you can start appealing to the top 40%. And if you can get 40% out of 60%, that's 2/3, you can win majority governments. And Klein won how many in Alberta, to our shame? And Harris won 2 in Ontario. Christy Clark won 1 in BC after Gordon Campbell won 1. So these are the kind of governments that can just simply focus on upper income people and say, we'll put some more money in your pocket. So if we're going to change things, have a peaceful revolution, we're going to have to mobilize people, and we're going to have to deal with demobilization. So I was very pleased to see the turnout and the success of the Go Vote campaign the Council of Canadians ran, and the voting campaigns that the trade unions ran. This is an important step. You know, there's been a view on the left for a long time that electoral politics were sort of a waste of time and something we didn't have to concern ourselves with. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. People fought very hard for the vote, and the vote is an incredibly important instrument of civic justice. Well, that brings me to the 5th law of politics, the one that is about justice and ethics. So let's call it ethics, the law of ethics. Politics is about what's right and what's wrong. It's not just about preferences, as rational choice political theorists would have us believe. And it's not just about good or bad, I like or I don't like. It's about what's right and what's wrong. Acting politically, you really want to have an ethical base of some kind if you're going to make some change. And that ethical base can be ecological. It can be of any number, social justice based, but you need an ethical base. The dominant ethic in our society is self-interest. I came out when the first CCPA alternative budget was done many years ago. I was invited by Preston Manning to Calgary to put my alternative budget, my CCPA alternative budget, on the table next to the Reform Party budget. And the first thing he said to me, he said, well, why don't you just let people leave their money in their jeans? Why don't people just get to keep their money in their jeans? And that's what the promise that Stephen Harper was making in the last election campaign. We've cut taxes, we'll let you keep your money. and we'll defend you from a fragile world economy. We'll act in your self-interest. And 32% of Canadians agreed with them, and they did that. But there are other alternatives. There is a whole slew of social liberal ethics to choose from. Political science students will be familiar with John Rawls, who does a priori account of ethics. You don't know whether you're low income, middle income, or upper income. So what kind of welfare system would you design, not knowing where you stand? Well, I'm not a big fan of that approach, personally. Amartya Sen, Nobel Prize winner, I don't think his book on justice is that great, but he starts off with the idea that what we need to do is correct injustices. Let's start by making things that are wrong, and obviously wrong, let's get rid of them. The kind of ethics that interest me are socialist ethics, from each according to their abilities, to each according to their needs. I think that's a good ethic. Meeting basic human needs is an important part of any kind of political program. I remember being at a presentation made by Jack Layton on a pre-budget presentation before they in fact pulled the trigger and triggered an election. And I looked at the 5 proposals he was making. Every family should have a doctor. We should reduce the cost of home. And I thought to myself, well, he is at least addressing basic human needs. There's something here that meets a real need for people. And I think that you can, and in fact it has been done, develop an ethic, a political ethic around meeting basic human needs. And those include for security, the kind of security that comes when you have food security, water security, etc. Corporate ethics, whatever you can get away with. So there's Conrad Black. He didn't get away with it. There was a lovely comment about Stephen Harper that was made by a Radio Canada journalist, a great journalist, Michel Deshotels, who said that Stephen Harper left Ottawa the way that Conrad Black left his office building in Bay Street out the back door, taking files that didn't belong to him. Well, the world that I've seen evolve in my career sort of ended with this idea of ethics, and I got involved with the Ethics and Economics book that Michael mentioned. It was based on the Catholic social bishops who in 1983 claimed that Canada was a moral disorder had been revealed in Canada by the capitalist crisis, and proposed some solutions. And one of the solutions was a preferential option for the poor, that all policies should be undertaken with an eye to what does this do for poor people. And another principle was that the rights of labor should the needs of labor should take precedence over the wants of capital. The needs of labor over the wants of capital. It sounded sort of 19th century, but it sounded so true as well. Well, if we look at our society today and say, well, what is it that's confronting us as Albertans, as Canadians, and what are the things that we should be talking about and doing about? I'd like to mention very briefly 3 subjects, some of which are being treated more extensively at this conference. The first is one dear to my heart. I think we have to renegotiate an intergenerational bargain. When I was at university, it was understood that my tuition, I would be able to earn my tuition in two months of work in the summer, and that if I received income advantages throughout my life as a result of my education, then I would pay back to society through a progressive income tax so that students after me would have the same opportunity. And when I arrived at the Department of Finance, one of my colleagues explained to me the way the pension system works. He said, well, it's pretty simple. He said, You know, there's some people who are working and some people are retired. So the people who are working transfer money to the people who are retired. And when they cease working, they'll receive a transfer. So it's a transfer system. Well, we've gummed this up in such a way that, first of all, we have screwed our students by telling them that their education is a personal good and not a public benefit. We've decided we should load them down with debt. You know, you meet somebody in a nice cafe and, well, I've got $25,000 worth of debt and I've got $40,000 worth of debt. And, you know, you don't even have a house and you're just meeting. I mean, what kind of situation is this to offer our young people? If you're trying to survive today on a Canada pension plan, you're in tough condition. You certainly can't afford a proper retirement home. So as a starter, I'd say I'd like to see an alliance between seniors and students, and I'd like to see a new intergenerational bargain. I would like to see free tuition fees like they have in Scotland. There's no reason Canadian students should pay tuition. And I'd like to see the Canada Pension Plan doubled. And the Canadian Labour Congress has been lobbying for this for some time. And I think it would have happened. Jim Flaherty was in favour of it. But guess what? The Minister of Finance in Alberta came out against it. And Stephen Harper then gave some money to Jean Charest in Quebec, and he came out against it. So I really believe that this intergenerational bargain, it's based on fiscal policy of transfers to provinces and to individuals, and we need to get this fiscal policy language, get rid of it, and put it in terms that people can understand about how the things that we create together we need to be able to share together, and to do that at various stages in our lives. One of my interests, research interests, has been poverty and how we deal with issues like low wages. And Greg Olson's here and he's going to talk to that tomorrow morning. I must say that poverty analysts have spent a lot of time doing numbers and showing how many people are poor. And people have done very generous work in explaining the plight of people in poverty. But we're still not dealing with it, as Alex Himmelfarb pointed out last night. Well, I think if we start to think of the issues, the social programs that we need so much, and we put them under the rubric of social determinants of health, that will perhaps bring forward a paradigm which will enable people to support the kind of measures that we need to deal with poverty. You know, when you think of what I described earlier as this process of let's cut wages, let's cut access to unemployment insurance, let's leave the provinces alone on welfare, and then what is the result starting in '95? We find people living on the streets. Well, in Vancouver, there's a group that says homelessness is not the problem. The problem is what makes people homeless. And that problem is that we're not dealing with the social determinants of health in Canada. We don't look at early childhood education. We don't take poverty seriously. And poor people are the ones who end up using the health system and have poor health. So I think if we could get a conversation going about the importance of the health of all people in our society for the health of the society, that would help us transform this country. And finally, there's the issue of, that faces us of building a green economy, moving to away from a carbon economy. I grew up in Alberta, and one of the things that we were told when I was a child and there were civil defense actions was that Alberta was a likely source of attack in a nuclear war because of our oil reserves. And we grew up, our identity was tied to the fact that we had oil wealth. And the bitumen sands were first really well analyzed in a wonderful, wonderful work of Canadian political economy by Larry Pratt of the University of Alberta, a book called The Tar Sands. And we looked at that as an asset, as something that was vital. Well, I'm not, people can read Gord Laxer's book and come to his book launch tonight, and they'll learn a lot about the situation around the tar sands today. But what I want to throw out at people today is what I'd like to see happen in Alberta, and I'm sure there's a lot of work in this direction already, is I'd like to see sunny Alberta take the lead in promoting solar energy. Growing up here, there was a gas company, publicly owned. It had a sign, "Look up, the sky above you, natural gas keeps it that way." Well, sunny Alberta has the climate to be able to develop solar energy. There are now lithium batteries being made to solve the problem of how to store the surplus energy. We've got to think about ways of getting a grid or getting people off a grid and on a battery. Perhaps transforming existing cars from gas guzzlers. 80% of our fuel consumption, 80% of our carbon consumption in Canada is fuel consumption. And I think I'd like to see the Alberta government take a big lead on that and do it under public control, the public enterprises that Alex Himmelfarb talked about last night. I think those are my choice of three issues that I think as Albertans and as Canadians that I would like to see us work on transforming. One of the things about this intergenerational bargain that I just want to mention is that we are about to see, as my generation and those following pass on, the greatest transfer of wealth in the history of humanity. It's going to go through inheritance. The thing about debt is that if you owe the debt, you're in trouble. But if you own the debt, it's an asset. So the more debt there is, the more public debt there is, there's more assets there are. And so the issue of leaving the current generation with debt is an absurdity. What we're leaving the current generation with is assets as well as debts. And if we want to reduce the debt for whatever reason, then simply tax inheritance properly. I mean, the liberal view was always that people should start at the same place. And these people starting on third base who think they've hit a triple, who seem to populate our, including the Minister of Finance offices, this is the kind of issue that's a tough issue that we have to deal with if we're doing the intergenerational bargain. The other issue that's a tough one that we have to deal with if we're looking at greening our economy is that the other great industry of Alberta after oil is, of course, livestock. And livestock, according to the FAO, Food and Agricultural Organization, are responsible for 40% of greenhouse gas emissions, livestock. So cutting back on livestock, going to a society which doesn't raise meat, doesn't raise animals to kill them for meat and for food, is something that a lot of people don't want to hear about. Al Gore didn't talk about it in his Inconvenient Truth. Naomi Klein doesn't talk about it, and this could change everything. But this is an issue, and there are a lot of young people, of course, in Canada, and I'm sure in this room, who've already made their decision on this. But it's a debate and discussion that has to happen, and it's not going to be an easy one because it's very close. I have two grandfathers, Albertans. One was a railroad engineer, Duncan Cameron, and the other, Charles Bennett, was a farmer in the black dirt country south of here in the Killam area. And of course, he had animals as well. Well, that was us. What about now? What is the situation now? I guess where I'm at is that the other superpower in the world is public opinion. The United States is the hegemonic world power, but the other superpower is public opinion. And public opinion is a really important aspect of any kind of political transformation. The great French general and leader, Charles de Gaulle, used to say that politics was the battle for public opinion. Now, it's very inconvenient that the ownership of the means of communication lie in the hands of the corporate elite that dominate our economy and that provide us with our governing ideology of neoliberalism. And you can sort of see this at work in the recent election where the Globe and Mail was supporting the Conservative Party but not the Prime Minister. And all the post-media papers got an order to support the Conservative government of Stephen Harper. So if you're dealing with this kind of a media atmosphere, some of us remember when newspapers used to be about informing and educating people. And indeed, the Southern chain of newspapers provided a lot of information and a lot of education. There's been what I like to call the attack on knowledge that is sort of generalized in the media. The first thing is that we don't see any experts interviewed anymore. We get journalists interviewing journalists. So where are our experts? Where are the people that really know? Why aren't they the ones that what we hear in the media? Why aren't they the ones who are being quoted? Instead, we get corporate spokespersons and corporate press releases being rewritten. I was talking to Samantha, who's the organizer of the event here. She's a journalist. She was working with CTV, and she said, I don't know how we can do some of these current shows anymore with the people that are just being laid off. And the point is that they're going to do them by allowing the corporate media an upper hand. The second thing that happens in this attack on knowledge is that history is forgotten. There's no history. So, I mean, how many people know that the CCF was founded in Calgary, not in Regina? How many people have a feel for the importance of socialism as a movement in Europe? I mean, it's treated as if it was something strange, when in fact it's part of Canadian heritage and very much a part of Western Canadian heritage. The third thing, of course, is in this attack on knowledge is to see everything through the eyes of the investor. So politics is about investment. And that means that the economy is about existing wealth. It's about maximizing existing wealth. So we hear about the price of gold. Well, who holds gold? I don't know how many different stock market indexes. I mean, how many people own stocks in China or Moscow or wherever these things are being touted? So we're told that investment and holding investments is, in fact, some form of success, when in fact there are lots of other criteria for success, including, are we creating new jobs for our young people, and are we creating new wealth doing that? And is this wealth in a form other than financial and something that can be shared and will enrich our lives? The role of newspapers and of the media in general is, in addition to informing and educating, it became entertainment. And we've reached, I guess, the summit of this when you have a reality TV star who is leading the Republican race for the presidential nomination. So that people have all of a sudden confused what it is to have a brave citizen who's prepared to stand up and sacrifice for the public good with some kind of clown who's prepared to go on television and have some fun. And this entertainment I'd like to be entertained too. I'm all in favor of entertainment. But it's gotten to the point where when we do examine and value public opinion, we do it through opinion polls. And the opinion polls, when they first started off, George Gallup said, well, I think that, that would be part of the entertainment section of the newspaper. We'll find out what people like to have for breakfast and what kind of car they want to drive, and we'll do all these different polls, and we'll find out what attitudes are. Well, there's been a long debate, and there's a very good article in the current issue of the New Yorker about it, about the issue of polling as a democratic tool or as a tool of manipulation. And our polling has become less and less scientific because In the old days, you phoned people with landlines, that famous 80% of the people who were voting, you phoned them, and they told you, they answered the phone and they answered the survey. Now, a high percentage of people don't have landlines. A lot of them won't answer surveys. Some people are doing it online, but online you come to them rather than them coming to you. So the scientific validity of these polling is very suspect. And yet, if you look at the way the last election campaign was conducted, the NDP's leading in the polls, and the watch was on how soon would they start to fall. The Liberals were trailing how soon would they start to rise. And once those two narratives started to combine, then the journalists had their stories, and they started writing those stories. And you wonder to what extent it's reflecting reality or creating reality. Well, that's, of course, I'm not here at the mic to campaign for rabble.ca, but that's why I got interested in writing a weekly column online and seeing if we couldn't have our own Canadian source of online news and see if we couldn't inform and educate and also dialogue with each other in a way that we couldn't in the old newspaper days, really. And we've got positives of this and we've got negatives of this. But we're definitely in a new environment, and it's an environment which I think is capable of giving us a peaceful revolution. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Duncan, for that really fabulous speech. Duncan has very graciously agreed to take some questions, and we've got some time here to do so. We've got two individuals who are going to be carrying handheld mics. If you'd like to indicate that you're interested in asking a question or offering a comment, please raise your hand and we'll try to spot you and get a mic to you. When you've concluded answering your question, if you wouldn't mind turning the microphone off, because we can only have one mic on at a time in this auditorium. So, anybody who would like to start us off then, please. Sure, up on the left, gentleman in the blue shirt. We'll take several questions at a time.
Okay. Hi, thanks for your presentation. My name is Ian Huzzy. I am a researcher with the Parkland Institute. I've read a number of your articles for Rabble and appreciate the work you do there. I don't often speak at public events like this, but I did want to rebut something you said about the federal Liberals' middle-class tax cut. It has nothing to do with the middle class, as you spoke about Thomas Piketty. His policy is the middle class is people who make $120,000 to $200,000 a year, and he's reducing taxes for those people, and he's not really changing taxes for people in my income bracket who are actually in the middle class. So I would ask that we start to think critically about that and not reproduce the Prime Minister's framing on what middle class is, what a middle class tax cut is, because his tax cut has nothing to do with the actual middle class.
Okay, thank you. If we can get another question maybe from up on the right side here. Anyone at all? Sorry, your left, my right. Anyone, anywhere. Oh, okay. Please, if you would. Microphone's on its way.
Saying, but about the tax cuts, but anyway, you can explain that. My question is if you think 4 years is enough time to have this change the narrative. My bent is that we need to talk about a fair voting system that represents the majority, the true majority. And I wonder if you think that there's any opportunity to actually make that happen, maybe in Alberta for Rachel Notley to bring that up, or for people to get behind it, because it's quite a simple concept, the idea of fairness. I mean, it can get complicated after that, I guess. But if you think it's possible, I guess, or the importance of it. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. And one more. Please, right in the middle here.
Thanks. Thank you. In terms of your anti-poverty initiative, one of the three that you listed, I wondered if you'd comment on the guaranteed basic income and the work of the Basic Income Canada Network, and finally a policy that would, on a human rights basis, every citizen of Canada would be entitled to food and shelter.
Well, I'll start with the last question. I've gone back and forth on this. I was initially quite in favor of it when I first heard about it as a young economist at the Department of Finance. It seemed to make sense to me. Later was explained to me by some feminist economists that if we were to do this, that would mean that we'd be giving up a lot of programs that were targeted to people on unemployment insurance, for instance, who their income would go down if we did a one type citizens' income, and which would replace existing programs. Then we developed the program you're talking about, which is a check which would go to every Canadian. And that was discussed in Canada in the 1970s, and there was even a test done on it. And my mind is open on that. But I think what I would lean to, if you ask me what could I do tomorrow, it would be to a jobs guarantee, that we would have jobs boards in Alberta, and that any person who was looking for work would go to the jobs board and they would get a job, and that job will be attached with an income to it. And then we would have proper social wages, including for our athletes and for our artists and others who should have some kind of income to allow them to do what they're doing, and that would now include, I think, journalists, to do what they're doing and to receive some public support for that. So I think now I lean towards the jobs guarantee, but I'm open. I'm still listening to the conversation around citizens' income. My initial instinct was to support it. On the question of electoral reform, I think it's really intriguing to think that what could be done in Alberta, and I hope that there will be a commission set up to look at it, and that Rachel Notley will consider bringing it in before the next election. I really think it's a terrific idea. If I understand the situation federally, the Liberal Party is in favor of an alternative ballot. So you would mark your ballot 1, 2, 3, 4, and then you take the 4s and you add their 2s to the other votes. And this is probably a less democratic system than a proportional representation system, a mixed member proportional. And how we would get there federally, I think it was in the cards if we'd had a Liberal or NDP minority government. But with majority governments, I think there'll be a lot of room for discussion outside. I don't know how much action will actually occur. I may have misrepresented the tax cut. I read the analysis that was done by Michael McDonald of the CCPA, and what Trudeau proposed was a new tax bracket to tax the upper income people, I think above 200,000. But to fund that, he was going to do a middle class tax cut, which is for the people below 200,000, but above say 80, but it might have been 120. And the money that additional money that would come in from the 1% would go to the two brackets or the two groups just below that, so that the 50% of Canadians who were below the median would get nothing from this. And those are the regular Canadians, or what Piketty called the poor. So Piketty had narrowed the middle class down to a group above that 50%. Now, not all of those will benefit. You're probably right. Maybe only 20% will benefit from that tax cut. It's not what you'd consider the middle class growing up in the 1950s, where it would be everybody but the top 10% and the bottom 10%.
Okay, additional questions? Just immediately above you there, sure, or below, either one, you choose. Thank you.
Now. So you mentioned in your laws all sorts of interesting, fantastic things, but I sort of asked a question similar to this yesterday of the speaker. We're all here, and we all generally are going to agree that these are the sorts of initiatives that we need to be taking forward, and the kind of issues that we need to focus on. But the leaders in our communities don't necessarily agree. When I go back to Calgary, when people go back to Red Deer, when people go back home, the people that run their community boards, the people that are leaders within the community, probably disagree with me on a lot of things. How would you suggest we approach those sorts of people? How do we talk about these sorts of things with people who aren't coming from the same perspective as us? How do we talk to the people that have bought into the investor perspective, who aren't investors, who are like us, wage earners? How do we convince them that their worldview, I don't want to say it's wrong, but how do we convince them that their worldview is wrong?
Fantastic. Sure, please, right in the middle here, just down about row 6 or 7. Well, we probably need you on our audio as well, too.
All right. So this question actually comes via Twitter from the Canadian Worker Cooperative Federation that asked that someone here at the conference today would ask whether, or rather how, you see worker co-ops fitting into a democratic green economy.
Okay, and from Twitter, and how about one more before we hand it back to our speaker? Sure, in the red sweater and the vest.
When you talked about the idea of a jobs board, it seems to me without publicly funded, universally accessible childcare, that would just perpetuate discrimination and inequities.
Well, thanks. Let's talk about childcare. I wrote a column during the election about, one of the first ones was about how the Liberal Party seemed to be fishing for right-wing votes because they were against minimum wages and they didn't support a universal childcare program. And I think one of the reasons they didn't support it was that there was a big battle in Quebec for Quebec, and the NDP was holding Quebec at 50% in the polls. But the NDP's major promise was $15 a day childcare, and Quebec already had childcare for $7 a day. And I think the Liberals saw that this was a mistake, a strategic mistake, and so they went after it. But I think one of the things that has to happen is that the groups like Martha Friendly and others who've been fighting for this for years have to redouble their efforts, because it's a hugely important program, and I put it under the rubric of social determinants of health, early childhood education, and the ability of people to improve their standard of living by creating a whole bunch of new jobs that don't cost anything to create. I mean, we just do this, which is a form of new wealth creation, so it's very important. And on the Twitter question about worker co-ops, I've long argued that we're in a straitjacket around our forms of ownership. We have public ownership, which I support and I think is vastly superior to private in almost any circumstance. But we have small-scale operations. I don't think we need publicly owned restaurants. And I don't think we need, I think we should have publicly owned golf courses. Because I learned to play golf on one, it cost $5 for the summer for my parents to get rid of me and get me out of the house. So I think a lot of assets, public assets, are really important, but we need new forms of social ownership, and that would include workers' co-ops. I argue, in fact, that one of the things that I would put on the table for building this green economy is that not only taxing inheritance, but establishing, the Alberta government could establish the Alberta Investment Bank, where it could take the treasury branches and convert them into an investment bank. And it would go and borrow money from Albertans, and Albertans would lend it to them and get better interest than they're getting from their banks. And it would then, without creating, with creating assets for Albertans, it would then make loans to companies like worker co-ops. It's quite often the case that what kills a small enterprise is that for the first 5 years you don't make any money. And if people watched the Bombardier deal that just came down from the Caisse de dépôt in Quebec, the Caisse de dépôt bought a bunch of bonds from Bombardier, and they pay, the Caisse is supposed to be paid 11% on these bonds, but it's going to be paid nothing for 5 years. And that's presumably the period that Bombardier Rail needs to get back on track, so to speak. So these worker co-ops, if they were to get 5 years of quiet money, and then if they were successful, then they begin to pay it back. It would be like taking equity ownership. You're selling your equity in your venture or lending it to the investment bank, and then the investment bank lets you create the wealth that you think you can create, and then you buy it back from them. Of course, you've left me with the toughest question of all, is how do we communicate our views to other people? I guess, I think I really believe that the kind of change I'm thinking of a peaceful revolution, is a knowledge-based change. So it comes from places like the Parkland Institute and the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives doing studies, and from having communications people like Colleen Fuller, who's here and will be speaking tomorrow, who are very, very capable of writing about and explaining to anybody very complicated issues. And it comes from having outlets like Rabble, which can help educate a new generation of trade union leaders and of students and of other simply concerned citizens into the potentials that exist if we step out of that sort of box that we've been put into of neoliberalism. Now, I understand fully that if you're 55 years of age, that you're concerned about your investments if you have any, because you're concerned about your future and providing for your family. All I want to say is that shouldn't be the only consideration. Public policy shouldn't all be driven by that. It should be driven by things that are much wider, much more important, and I think ultimately much more beneficial to everybody, including the 55-year-old with investments.
In the blue shirt and black sweater, so it'll take a second to get the mic over there. If you can.
Thank you. Is it on? That was great, Duncan. I really enjoyed it. I had a question, or actually I wanted you to explain a little bit about the intergenerational bargain. I think that's a great, that is something that really has to happen in Canada. And my question is, why do you envision this as an intergenerational bargain between seniors and students when there are so many young people who can't afford to go to school and are working and are a lot of them are trade union members. I mean, the labor movement is one place where there should be and could be an actual intergenerational bargain, and where actually there is some effort to do that. So I'm wondering if you can explain if that was just a misstatement or if you actually had an idea about seniors and students specifically.
And maybe just down here at the front. Oh, I'm sorry. Did we just take the mic away from you? I'm so sorry, I didn't see that. We'll come right back to you, and that'll be our final question then, okay?
To push it. In addition to political laws, do you have any suggestions that might help the political parties, obviously the left, between elections, the candidates, many good candidates that lost federally, how to generate more participation in their ridings, in their constituency for the party between elections?
And our last question.
Okay, so I just wonder if you could elaborate maybe a little bit more on what you mean by jobs board as opposed to guaranteed basic income, because it seems like it's not always, having a job isn't always the answers, because it doesn't always remove barriers that folks might have in ways that, like, maybe it's a little bit ableist, maybe they can't work, or maybe there's like other barriers such as childcare, access to transportation, education, things of that manner.
Well, I'll deal with the last question first. The basic job guarantee you have when you're growing up is if your father or mother can hire you in their business, and that happens quite frequently. My dad was in the building supply business, and he supplied some materials to the Edmonton Art Gallery, and he included me as part of the bargain, and I went over and sort of hung pictures and artifacts in this museum. And that was my first sort of paid job. So I think that the equivalent would be having community-based jobs boards, which would collect from members of the community what was the work you think needs to be done that isn't being done. Because we know there's all kinds of it. There's a lot of things that could be done that are just not being done. Childcare is one of them, but there's lots of other things. So it would be a collection of what kind of work needs to be done, and then an accounting of the kinds of skills that are needed, and seeing if you can't match people who are looking for work with work that needs to be done, and be prepared to fund it, as opposed to pass out money and allow people to fend for themselves. Whether it would work or not, I'm not entirely sure, but I think, to me anyway, it makes a lot of sense. On Colleen's question, you've added an element that I didn't include in my talk, but which I've been an advocate for a long time, and that is wage solidarity policy. If you look at, I remember one of the first studies that the CCPA in BC did, Seth Klein looked at youth incomes. And youth incomes are about where they were in the 1970s, and that was in the 90s, and I doubt whether they've improved. So the youth have not benefited at all from any kind of increases in productivity and on all the other things that have happened. And when I thought of the University of Ottawa and my own political science department, I was hired in 1975, and there was a guy hired in 1976 and a guy hired in 1977, guys. And then once the university figured out most of the people in the department were Marxists, and that they were, therefore not contributing to civilization adequately, the department started not being able to hire anybody. So we went 10, 15 years without having any new blood, and that's not good. I mean, if we had some, I might have not gone off to the CCPA and other things, but it would make sense in a university environment to hire a group of people at what you'd call an apprentice wage for 2 or 3 years to see if they liked what they were doing and they were able to do it to the satisfaction of their colleagues. Then give them big raises at the early part of their life when they want to get settled and maybe start a family or do something of that nature. And then level it off once they hit mid-career and not tie their pension to the level of their salary. And I would much have preferred to have less salary and more young colleagues than to have the salary that I had, the additional amount, which, I either wasted or it paid taxes on or what have you. So I think that wage solidarity policies throughout the union movement and organized by the union movement are really important. And unfortunately, we're going the other way, I think, on that. Now, I've forgotten the other question.
Please supplement your rules of politics.
Thank you. My favorite question. That was my favorite question. I joined the New Democratic Party in the year 2000. I did it, I just moved to Quebec from Ottawa, and I'm still working in Ottawa. And therefore, there was a Quebec New Democratic section. You could join the federal party without being a member of the provincial party, which made it easier for me to join, actually. I had Alexa McDonough sign my card. And the party was going through one of its periodical reviews, so I wrote a brief for the committee, the review committee. And my point was really that political parties need to be mass parties, have members, not parties of 100,000 donors who get called 5 times a week, but they need to be parties of members, and they should be centered on riding associations, and that the riding associations should be the information and educational arm of the party. And they should be there to educate the potential candidate or the sitting member, to educate the surrounding community. They should be a hub of activity and political activity. And they shouldn't be about raising money for candidates at election time. They should be primarily about preparing the population for a shift in public opinion. And I really believe that socialism's too many meetings, maybe, but if you had good speakers and good events, that you would draw people and people would learn together. When I got involved in the fight against free trade, and I started getting invitations to speak at various trade unions in particular, the thing that struck me was how much I learned from the people I talked to all the time. I mean, they could give you, chapter and verse on what was going to happen in their industry as a result of that, and I'm just taking notes. I mean, we had an overview, had some pretty good ideas of what was going on, but on the ground, what was happening. So the sharing of knowledge, of experience-based knowledge, is a really important thing to do, and I think that's what political parties should do.
Duncan, I just wanted to thank you briefly for what has been a very rich and insightful series of comments on the complex entanglements that come to bear on matters of the peaceful revolution. This is clearly the fruit of a lifetime of really wonderful experience and deep and careful thought, and we're grateful to have had you come and share those with us. Thank you so very much. A small gift of our appreciation. Thank you. Thank you all very much for joining us. I understand there are more events to come, but you've got a small break ahead of you. Enjoy.